I think one of the issues that's come up in the last 2 weeks is one of the former MPs for Slough, John Watts, asked a question on the 30th of July 1984 and got a response from the Foreign Minister. Perhaps you'd want to share your thoughts about that response and what it means.
I think that this response is a really important part of the business of trying to uncover the truth here. We've seen the documents that have been revealed, and they suggest that Britain played some role in the events of 1984 and the invasion of the Golden Temple. We don't know yet, because not all the documents are in the public domain, what role. But there is a specific answer to my predecessor on a question he asked on the 30th of July 1984. He said, what discussions have there been between the British government and the government of Indira Gandhi? That was Mrs. Thatcher and Mrs. Gandhi, who were both leading those countries at that time. And the answer he received was, we have not sought any discussions with the government of India. This is an internal matter. Now, I believe that that misled Parliament, and I've spoken to the Cabinet Secretary and said, is his inquiry into what happened going to include the issue of what Parliament was told? And he has assured me that it will include the issue of what Parliament was told. As I reread that answer, I wonder if this is a civil servant's device to say we haven't sought discussions. That doesn't mean that we haven't had discussions, because we clearly have, and that's obvious from the documents that we have. And by saying twice, we haven't sought discussions and it's an internal matter for the government of India, by that kind of double rejection, it makes it seem very clear that Britain hasn't had such discussions when now we know it did. So I think there's an issue about truth-telling to Parliament here. And the reason why I think truth-telling to Parliament's important is, in a democracy, that's the way that the citizen can find justice and truth. And if Parliament isn't told the truth, then what's the point of democracy, frankly? We can just have a bunch of dictators who lie. And it really is a fundamental principle that Parliament must be told the truth. And we want to be sure that we're going to be told the truth now with this inquiry, because it's only a review. It's not going to have the kind of wide scope that I think we will need, but it is the first stage, and in that first stage we need to find the truth.
Fiona, you mentioned that you spoke to the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Jeremy Hayward. Within the community there's been lots of talk of full disclosure. I haven't yet met a politician that believes there will be full disclosure, because by its very nature it's virtually impossible.
At this point, I don't think we will have full disclosure as a result of this review, it's called, rather than an inquiry. That's quite interesting in itself. But I think that it will reveal more than we know now. And my judgment is that what we have to do is take this in steps. The government originally said, no, we didn't do any of this stuff, as the reply to John Watts says. And actually, some of your audience will remember television programmes at the time when, representatives of Britain was saying it's got nothing to do with us in various ways. So it was the public was lied to as well as Parliament, it seems to me. So I think this is going to give us some of the truth. It's going to give us probably some more documents. It will not. It seems fairly clear to me from the response I've had so far. I think that documents which are traditionally withheld for more than 30 years, Secret Service documents and so on, aren't likely to be revealed. But Sir Jeremy has said that the decision about those kind of documents will come at the moment of report. So some might be. But this is the first. It's like peeling an onion, actually. This is the first layer of skin that's coming off the onion. We then need to decide how we get the next layer off, and the next layer off, and the next layer off. And the problem is, when you peel an onion, you end up crying. And there will be tears before this is finally made clear, I fear.
Fiona, just one final question for the time being. You spoke at Sri Guru Singh Sabha Slough on Sunday and the Ramgiri Gurdwara the previous week, and you mentioned Bloody Sunday in Hillsborough on the one hand, and also there was a question posed about Ed Miliband, and I know Ed Miliband issued a statement before parliamentary questions. Perhaps you just want to share with the viewers your thoughts on Sunday and Ed Miliband's statement.
Well, Ed Miliband has made it very clear that he supports full disclosure here. In my view, it's actually quite important that nobody is trying to make political capital of this. I feel that very strongly, that actually this is a matter of human rights and justice, and that when it comes to justice, I think my party actually has a better record than any other party. I wouldn't I? But I actually think on this issue, what we have to do is work together. And I've been very disappointed when hearing members of Parliament in another party sort of implying that it's all their work. I don't want to imply it's all my work. I don't want to imply it's all Pat McFadden and Tom Watson, who were Labour MPs who pioneered this. I don't want to imply it's their work. I don't want to suggest that because Ed Miliband, the Labour leader, has made a statement that somehow the fact that the Prime Minister has also spoken on this is irrelevant. It's not. This is an issue of human rights and basic justice. I think that my party has been the driving force in uncovering it, but I want every party to unite around human rights and justice. And the reason why I referred to Hillsborough is because I think that this review isn't going to get to the full truth. I think that we're going to have some independent, judge-led inquiry. It's striking that people will say, oh no, these events happened in India, they didn't happen in Britain, why should we have an inquiry here? Well, let's just think of how many thousands of people died as a result of the invasion of the Golden Temple and the Blue Sky operation which followed. And the extent of the assault on the Sikh community. It seems to me that if Britain played any role in that, we have to know about it because it's a stain on our country. And I think that's really important. And so I referred to those examples, Bloody Sunday and Hillsborough, because in both cases there have been judicial inquiries. They're both slightly different ones, actually, and there's an argument for having a slightly different one in this case. But nevertheless, I think we won't get to the truth until we get to that stage. We're going to get more of the truth through Sir Jeremy Hayward's inquiry, but we won't get the full truth until we have an independent inquiry. And that must be the next stage, and it must be one that all of us agree around, that it's truth-finding. You know, that is actually the first step to working out what should happen next. It's to agree and know what the truth is.
Dr. Jasdevra, I have one question for you.
No, it's not a question.
You want to add something?
You know, we respect Parliament is sovereign, and if it wants, it can get to some of the truth. I think there are a couple of issues in this whole thing. One is, did Britain participate in any way, even as an advice? The second is, ethnic minorities in this country are our sentiments and rights for bartering in international politics. Did, at that time, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, or the government, think that there are a significant number of British citizens Sikhs? The Darbar Sahib Golden Temple is like the Vatican. The Vatican is not confined in the Vatican. Every Catholic, whether it's in America or in Australia or here, has a direct association. We have a direct association. We have allegiance to this country, but we have a direct association with the Darbar Sahib. Did the government then not think, or did it think, oh, it's a small minority, it doesn't really matter? So that is one of the answers we would like whether there's going to be a change in the way foreign policy is conducted in this country in future?
I think we need to be careful about assuming that the advice that we know was to some degree given was the advice which led to the actions that the Indian government took. Because we only can see little bits of documents at the moment, it's actually possible that the advice, I mean, we don't know, and I'm not assuming either, but it is possible that Britain advised that this kind of action shouldn't be taken. I don't think it's likely, but it is possible, and that's one of the reasons why I've said you've got to do this step by step, because unless you find out the truth in one step, you're not going to get the next step of truth, if you see what I mean. So we don't know what advice Britain gave, but your point about do we disregard the rights and the kind of humanity and the
sentiments,
religious connections of minority communities, that's a really important point. One of the things I'm proudest of in politics is my role in getting the Human Rights Act onto the British legislation. We've always been signatories to the European Convention on Human Rights, but in 1998 we made it British law. Our newspapers keep saying that this is an act which simply protects people they don't like. They completely ignore the way in which it protects the rights of elderly people in care homes or the rights of ethnic and religious minorities and so on. It seems to me that it is important that we don't just rely on the goodwill of a government to protect the rights of minorities, that we actually enshrine protection of the rights of minorities in law, which is to some extent, not perfectly, to some extent what that law did. And I think that we need to ensure that every community in Britain has a right to be told the truth. And I think that the Sikh community at the time weren't told the truth, but I think the white community weren't told the truth either.
No.
And I think that is actually an important point in terms of our relationship with India. I mean, I spend quite a lot of time, I think I waste it really, but there you go, speaking to the Indian High Commission, their staff, their commissioners and so on, saying, look, I'm a friend of India, but there are some things you do that I really disapprove of. And I have these arguments about the death penalty as an obvious one. I have these rather fruitless arguments, but I think it's important that they know what I think, and that they know this, that I can be a friend of India and think their use of the death penalty is absolutely unacceptable. Because I don't think these two, India finds it difficult to believe I'm a friend and have that view, but I don't see any contradiction at all. I think I'm a friend of America and I find their use of the death penalty unacceptable. But it still doesn't stop me being a friend of that country in many regards.
So, I mean, under Labour, in the Home Office, when you were there, and then subsequently in DCLG, a process was started with the faith committees, Consultative Council of Faith Committees Unit, where consultations were taking place in legislation in this country. It'd be good if the Foreign Office also began something like that. My second point is, in the Iraq inquiry, it became quite obvious that some of the papers could not be revealed because there were correspondence between this country and the United States. Now, in international relations, it is an etiquette and perhaps an obligation that the UK cannot release letters unless the Indian government also agrees for those letters to be released. So I respect your desire to get to the truth. And however much Parliament tries, the UK government cannot release the letters that the Indian government does not consent. Because on the first day, the Prime Minister made two statements. The first statement was to assure the Sikhs that I will look into this, and the second statement was, I will look into how these papers got released. I believe that statement was addressing Indian concerns, not our concerns. That statement was addressed at the Indians. I will look into how these statements got release, because anything confidential between you and me, if I release it in the public, then it's a breach of confidence. It affects international relations. It affects friendly relations. So I think we may get some letters, and I know there's been a flurry of meetings now between Foreign Office and Indians on this, and we will get, I suspect, what you're saying, that we advised them not to do it, and they said they didn't listen to our advice. This is why on the second day when we, the British Consultative Forum, took a very strong position that we would like an international inquiry. We respect, I think the parliamentary inquiry should be why Parliament was misled and what are the rights of the minority communities in this country vis-a-vis the foreign policy in this country. But as far as this situation is concerned, so far India, as you rightly said, and Devendra said, India has been saying this is our internal matter. But now two countries are involved. However remotely Britain is involved, two countries are involved. It's no longer a matter, India's internal matter. So we think it's time for an international inquiry onto this. And I know there will be resistance from the government, but this is now a demand.
Shall I tell you why? I mean, thank you for saying that you felt that the Faith Consultative Committee, which I helped set up, was useful.
Yes.
And I think you're right, that those sorts of bodies can play a good role. The reason why I think we shouldn't move straight to an international inquiry is because I am pretty certain that India would kibosh it. I'm not suggesting that our next step is a parliamentary inquiry, which I think does risk some of the problems that you identify. I think it should be a judge-led inquiry, which is separate from a parliamentary inquiry, and which has some judicial powers. Now, you're right that documents which are exchanged through the diplomatic process between governments will not be revealed unless the government of India consents. But I think that it's clear from the documents we've already seen that there will be documents which are addressed from one part of the British government to, for example, the Foreign Secretary, or to another part of the British government. So there are documents which are not in the possession of India, as it were, which India doesn't have rights over, which can give us intelligence about what actually occurred. So it's important that we get all of those documents. My anxiety about an international inquiry is if you look at the history of so-called international inquiries, they get sabotaged very quickly by one partner. And in this case, in my view, India would sabotage it as the major partner. This happened on the territory of India. I think they would sabotage it before it could get going. And while I completely sympathise with your view that we need international clarity to get to the bottom of this, and I think at some point we probably do, I think that we've got to move things forward further before we have any chance of getting a competent international inquiry. In my view, actually, rather than an international inquiry, what we should do is have some kind of a judge-led inquiry, and then arguably this is a case for the International Criminal Court. Now, I've talked about two countries where I think I'm their friend, but I object to their use of the death penalty, the US and India. Strikingly, both those countries are not signatories to the International Criminal Court. But I think that ought to be where this potentially ends up.
Well,
and we need to try and find a structure which can end it there. And that's not easy, and I think that takes a bit of time.
I accept what you're saying about the need for, I think there is a need for an internal inquiry here, but the international inquiry we had in mind does not involve India, but it will expose India, and it's not at the ICC, it is at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which is in the International Court. Now, in the Permanent Court of Arbitration, a group of people can take the state, and what we would like is the UK to agree to that process, so the Permanent Court of Arbitration can then initiate an inquiry. It has done in many countries. The issue between Hawaii and the United States, there was an issue between Veer Savarkar and this country. These have been resolved there inquiries have been instigated to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So we have already written a letter. We've told the FCO this is what we require now. What we like is this country to agree to be party to that inquiry. It does not involve India. That the Indian dimension will come will be inevitable from the evidence that we provide and the evidence the UK provide. But the International Criminal Court is a different matter. That's down the line if something comes up in this country or comes up in India. And you're right, India will try and sabotage any process where India is a direct party. But we are not asking India to be a direct party here. We are asking the UK to be a direct party. The UK knew in February. The first thing is this attack was not a spontaneous attack. It was a premeditated attack. The Deputy Chief of the Armed Forces in India in 1983 advised Mrs. Gandhi, he was asked to plan an attack. He advised not to have this attack because it's going to divide the country and India may never recover from it. These are his words. She bypassed him and then elevated General Vaidya to the chief. He wrote an article in June. Kushwant Singh and Kuldeep Nayyar was an Indian High Commissioner here at one time. They have written this as well. The Sunday Times wrote an article in June 1984 that this attack was premeditated. Now these letters confirm that it was a premeditated. It was the British government knew in February. So the issue of the premeditation is now resolved. Okay. I'm not sure. Yeah, we're very interested in what Britain said or didn't say, but that is not actually going to lead to the solution. I think it's time, as a way, maybe perhaps as a way of redeeming itself, Britain should agree to be a party to an international inquiry where we can then start looking at the whole issue.
So one question is there, one side you asking we're going to ask only British and other national international community. And in answer your question you are saying India and British is both party because they wrote to the British.
No,
and
in the permanent court, there are different courts have different things. Either there's a dispute between two countries which goes to the international court, or a community can take a country. Now, by taking an issue which does involve a third country, the third country is not necessarily invited, okay? But the evidence is presented. Now, you see, Parliament here, with all due respect, sovereign, very powerful, although I don't agree, but I think Tony Blair did diminish Parliament in this country. Well, that's another matter. But Parliament cannot summon a single Indian person to the inquiry. They're not citizens of this country. The permanent court can request, at least. They have the authority to request. Parliament doesn't have even the authority to ask them to come. Okay? So if permanent court can request, if the Indians don't come, at least there's a big gap then we know. Okay? The inquiry, what Britain responds.
I'm not arguing for a parliamentary inquiry, but interestingly, Parliament does have a right to request foreign nationals. The committee on which I sit, the Public Accounts Committee, has actually done that with Google and other companies led abroad and actually asked them to account for themselves here in Britain. So it's not impossible to do that. And I don't think you and I are really arguing in principle. I think that the principle is clear, that the review conducted by Sir Jeremy Hayward is not in itself sufficient, that there has to be a process thereafter, that the process thereafter has to be capable of securing justice for those people who've lost loved ones as a result of the whole Blue Sky operation. Now, actually, the details of how that process operates is one that I think should be informed to some extent by us finding out more, because that will reveal the degree of British engagement and so on. And so I think the precise process of what needs to happen next to get more clarity is something that will become clearer when we get a report. One of the things that I'm worried about this review is that it might end up being a kind of written statement, that Parliament might not be able to debate it at all. We might see the kind of, not cover-up, but the kind of blanding about it. Oh, look, we're doing all these other lovely things to help the Sikh community. Stop getting boring about this, Fiona. I've seen those politics before, and I think that's a big risk. And my view is that those of us who want truth and justice should stay on where we're united, should focus together on getting as much truth as we can. I do think that this has got to become an international issue. The precise route to that, I think we can discuss when it's clearer.
We slightly differ there because we see, with all due respect, in 1984, Britain was a very powerful country, India was a weaker country. Today, Britain is a weaker country, India is a very powerful country. If in 1984 Britain could not stand up to India, I see I am very, very cynical about what you're saying. It's very nice words what Parliament can do. You can try and achieve.
I have fought for justice and human rights for 40
one
years.
MP in 600. What the government does and what Parliament does is an entirely different matter. Very few countries now stand up to India. This is why we think that, one, the correspondence is not going to be released unless India agrees. Secondly, there are limitations to what even a judge-led inquiry can achieve and what Parliament can do. Hence, I think it's time. And it's not this one instance, Fiona. There's been a litany of these sort of things. Don't forget, in the Chahal case, it was quite obvious he was being deported to India because there was a £2 billion agreement going on, and it was in the papers that this was to please India to stop the voice of Khalistanis here. And the Federation was banned, not because there was any evidence against it. The Baba Khalsa was banned. That was during Labour government. So there's a litany of these sort of things. So that's a different thing. How this country deals with the sentiments and the rights of the minorities in foreign policy. The other issue is that there are two countries now involved. It's time we get an international inquiry because UK cannot release the papers unless the Indian government gives it a consent. So I think we are going to differ. Parliamentarians, British parliamentarians always think the British Parliament is... We have seen the way it has worked in the last 30 years. So we have slightly different views on that.
Could I just sum up? Because I think, like I said, there isn't that much difference. There's a different approach.
In the intentions.
Yeah.
In the intentions are the same.
Yeah.
The routes are different.
Yeah. Because I think one of the things that when those letters first came out was, and that word will never go away, is complicit.
Yes.
That word complicit is the route into how far can you go, because as soon as another country... Since then, Tom Watson's revealed some other correspondence towards the end of 1984, which brings France, the US and Canada potentially into this debate as well. And I think in terms of a judge-led inquiry, a parliamentary inquiry, it will reveal more complicity, which would help in any international...
That's my view.
That's Fiona saying anyway.
Yeah.
But
The two processes can go parallel, so that one does not end up...
No, I'm not arguing against your process. I think they will work together.
The two processes can work together. So, I think we can carry on with the request. And the British government is not suddenly tomorrow going to say, yes, we'll agree to an international inquiry. The more things reveal, at least we have made a request to the Permanent Court that you be a party to this. And it has to be, without the consent of Britain, there will not be an international inquiry. And without this inquiry, we are not going to get to the root of what happened in India. Because in the end, our interest, yes, there is that issue about what about us in foreign policy, that bit, which your government addressed very adequately in the domestic laws, legislation and policies and things like that. But foreign policy is still blind to the sentiments and rights of ethnic minorities to some extent. And I think that needs to be resolved. But at the same time, We all want to know, and we want a solution. We want a solution that India will not do this ever again. See? And that solution can only come through some sort of an international arbitration. And however direct or indirect a method is, but that has to come.
But we also need to stop India having judicial murders, as they are planning with Balancing Rajana. I mean, so it's not just do this ever again.
Yeah.
It is ensuring that international pressure forces India, if it wants to have the leading role, which it does want to have internationally, to respect fundamental human rights.
Yes.
And the most fundamental human right is the right to life. So I think it's quite a package of things. These two things aren't directly connected, but actually there's much greater risk of India executing a Sikh activist at the moment than there is of there being a mass pogrom as there was in 1984.
The Armed Forces Special Powers Act. It's an extraordinary thing that if India was to attack Pakistan today, a Pakistani citizen has more rights against the Indian army because of the Geneva Convention than an Indian, because the Armed Forces Special Powers Act gives no right to an Indian to take the army to court, to question the army. Because as long as a general in the army says, I did this in good faith, this is why they haven't instigated a single inquiry into many allegations that the army during 1984, June 1984, killed people with their arms tied behind their backs. They killed innocent people there, randomly, and they killed injured people there. There was a doctor there who was trying to treat people, but they pushed the doctor away, killed them. But there can be no inquiry in India because the Armed Forces Special Powers Act prevents them, gives them immunity. Yet, a foreigner, if the Indian army attacks Pakistan, Pakistanis have greater rights than Indians. It's a paradox of it. And the UN has condemned this several times. So there's a whole baggage that needs to be exposed. But we need a process. And the process in Parliament, there is a limitation, but I think it will be a route, but it can run parallel.
Fiona, there is one question from my side, which when Dr. Rai presented to you his case. If we go for an international inquiry, do you think we will get something from this Parliament House documentation or any information? What is your opinion?
In a way,
about
the
this?
reason why I'm suggesting sequencing,
Yeah.
and I don't think I'm disagreeing with Dr. Rai's eventual ambition, but I am suggesting sequencing because the rule of law is important in Britain. I'm not saying that there aren't governments which have occasionally overridden the rule of law in Britain, but it is generally the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah.
And therefore, if the next stage is a judge-led inquiry, the pressure on the British government to play a constructive role internationally is enormously increased by that. And that's one of the reasons why, I use the analogy of peeling an onion, doing it layer by layer.
Yeah.
I think this is what needs to happen. I think that the evidence which my colleague Tom Watson has begun to uncover about other countries is also part of that onion peeling process, if you like. Because what we need to do is, it's politics really. You need to work out politically where you can actually have an influence. The conversations I've described myself having with the Indian High Commission about the use of the death penalty, frankly, have had no influence. Partly because they happen behind closed doors, but sometimes it's worth doing things which don't have an influence because they're right. And so I'm not ashamed of that. But actually on this one, we haven't only got to do what's right, we have also got to work out a strategy which has most effect and impact. And I think that to do that, we need all of those of us who agree on the fundamentals to not find divisions if we don't need to work together using the experience of each other, your points about the International Court of Arbitration, about which I have to confess I don't know a lot, the work that me and other people are doing in Parliament, the proposals for a judge-led inquiry, all those things seem to me to be advancing the same broad case. And what we need to do is to say, there is a fundamental principle here on which we all agree, that we all think these are steps that could be taken. They're not to be denigrated or ignored. And we're broadly united on that. In order not to, one of the problems about finding the differences in tactics is that you give space for government ministers to say things like they said in the reply to my predecessor. The British government hasn't sought discussions. Well, it's quite possible they didn't seek discussions, because guess what? The Indian government sought discussions. That's what the documents seem to imply. So they haven't sought discussions, and it's an internal matter for India, making everyone think there had been no discussions. Right? You know, we need to be very careful that we don't give space for that kind of nonsense to happen.
Yeah, that's true.
Could I just pick up on one issue which Dr. Rice touched upon, which is these events took place two and a bit weeks ago, and one of the things is, in one sense, it set back community relations with the Sikh community, because all of a sudden this was so pivotal in my life and lots of people's lives. It just forced people, even people that weren't born there, to think, why, you know, in a place like Harmandir Sahib, anyone that's been there, any non-Sikh that's been there, why would we even contemplate having anything to do with it? But I think just everything raises an interesting point, because whilst we can deal with community issues in this country and almost rebuild that relationship, there is this issue about the Foreign Office. How do you weigh up, you know, your own citizens' needs, whether they be Sikhs or any other religion, and your interests abroad? And India is just, you know, we know the present government, India is a major business partner. We found this in Europe as well. Europeans will hesitate because of the state of the economy to almost not raise some of the human rights issues. We've found that particularly at European Parliament. Just stay quiet about this, you know. What do you think can come out of this, you know, what good can come out of this in terms of moving that relationship?
Well, I've always believed that you must speak truth to power. And actually, I think, to be honest, I think Britain is better than some countries at doing this. I have regularly raised the issue of the death penalty and whether Britain has raised it. I mean, I did after the last visit to India, specifically raise with William Hague whether he had raised those issues with the Indian government, and was confirmed that there, you know, there had been specific representations made. And I do think Britain is, as I say, slightly better than some other countries about being this. But do you know what we tend to do? In a very quiet voice, if it's a powerful country, we kind of whisper our concerns. And it seems to me that that's actually one of the interesting jobs that Parliament must do, is kind of rebroadcast the whispers and make clear that these are principles that are very important to our nations. Actually, India goes around saying, I'm the biggest democracy in the world. Well, a democracy requires some fundamental human rights. And India does fulfill most of the requirements of a democracy. But I don't think that a country which executes its citizens can call itself a democracy, personally. It is. And I also think that there is a necessity, and in a way it's illustrated by what happened in South Africa. There is a necessity for a country to face up to its own history, to the truth of its own history. And even here, when I speak about this, my constituency has a very large Sikh community, but it also has a substantial Hindu and Muslim and many faiths in it. And I will speak about this, and some people who are perhaps supporters of the present government of India will say, no, this is all invented by a bunch of terrorists and things like that. You've heard those remarks. And my view is it's very simple, and that's why I talk about human rights. It's very simple that fundamental human rights are kind of non-negotiable. And if you use them as your guides, then you can have a true democracy. But if you avoid them for certain bits of your community, or if you don't face up to historical abuse of human rights, then actually your society is harmed by that. And I think India is harmed by the events of 1984.
Yeah, plus Indian politician thinking about, if you talk about human rights and tell them about the human rights, they're going to tell you you are a terrorist, you are a extremist. So that's kind of thinking of the politician in India. But I got one question for you, personally for you and for your party, because we know you're going to be elected again in this year 14, so you will be in the parliament, and we are hoping government will change, and maybe next government your party will come. And our main issue is with the Labour government, if that will come in the power. If we providing the human rights balance in India, so what your government and you going to support us to achieve that injustice with us? So if we provide the evidence, because we got a plenty of evidence since 1987 till 95. So now still sometime we are feeling we not achieving human rights in Punjab, in India. So if we are providing evidence to this government, because this government was involved in 1984, so they have to protect human rights activities. So innocent people, good citizen people were killed and tortured and destroyed. So many things has happened, and we got a proof. So in the future, Labour government and from your side, we are getting promise one kind of from your side or from your party to our nation, our community. We will shall get a support from the government for the human rights, on human rights.
The Labour Party is the party which made human rights part of UK domestic law. We're absolutely committed to human rights. And while there will be areas where there's, a definitional issue about human rights, my view is this: everybody deserves human rights.
Yeah.
I include terrorists in that, because the way to have justice is to say that even people who threaten the life of the nation have rights, because you can't make everyone confident that you have justice unless you have treated them with respect for their human rights. Yes, there are things that you ought to do to people who threaten the life of the nation that you wouldn't do to any other citizen. For example, the restraints that we put on people under the terrorism prevention orders and so on. But everyone, actually everyone, should have their human rights respected, because that way justice lies.
Yeah, because why I ask this question, so like British people, we got a support from our law of country. So in India, in Punjab, the people don't have a support. So that's why we are asking support who can influence and...
I completely agree.
Yeah.
I have constituents who have very different views on what should happen to Kashmir.
Yeah.
And I don't say I know what the future for Kashmir is. I don't say I know what its democracy should be, because I'm not Kashmiri. It's not down to me. But what I do know is this, that however Kashmir is administered, I have a responsibility as a Member of Parliament to fight for basic human rights standards to be accorded to everybody there. And that is a duty, I think, of a democratic politician anywhere in the world, that we can't tell other countries how to run themselves, but we can say we demand of other countries these standards, because they're international standards.
We got only 3 minutes left. Within 1 minute, what you want to say?
Well, I think in many ways where there is a concurrence on what he's saying, except that while I support a internal review, a judge-led review, and a parliamentary inquiry, I think at the same time the track for international inquiry will continue. It does not in any way detract what is going to happen in this country, but it does put pressure on the government that in the end all that information needs to be put at some international platform, and the UK should agree so that we have a complete inquiry into what exactly happened and what might be a good solution.
Thank you very much. Govinderji.
I think, without repeating things, I think the next probably few months will be interesting to see how the UK government moves in this direction of more disclosure via, say, other inquiries. But ultimately, you know, the one thing we talk about is we want the truth about what Britain did, but ultimately we want truth about what actually happened in 1984.
Yeah.
And that can only happen at an international level. How we get to that truth, you know, clearly is going to be difficult for India, and that's where other states, UK is one of them, will have to play a role.
Yeah. Fiona, finally, viewer of Sangat TV, what do you want to say?
Well, I would say thank you for allowing me to join in this really important conversation. And I think it's important that your viewers know that this has resonance in Parliament, that their concerns are echoed in the debating chambers of the nation, because they have a right to be heard.
ਥੈਂਕ ਯੂ ਸੋ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ ਹੈ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਸ਼ੋਅ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜੋ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ, ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਜਸਦੇਵ ਰਾਏ ਜੀ ਨੇ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੰਟਰਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਇਨਕੁਆਇਰੀ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਜਾਵਾਂਗੇ, ਉਹਦੇ ਲਈ ਤਿਆਰੀ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ। ਦਵਿੰਦਰਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਗੁਰਾਂ ਨੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਹੈ, ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਫਿਊਨਾ ਜੀ ਨੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਜੋ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਮਿਲ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੌਲੀ ਹੌਲੀ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਅਚੀਵ ਕਰੀ ਚੱਲੀਏ ਤੇ ਅੱਗੇ ਵਧੀ ਚੱਲੀਏ ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹਦੇ ਐਂਡ ਤੇ ਸੱਚ ਤੇ ਪਹੁੰਚਣਾ। ਸੋ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਫਿਰ ਆਪ ਜੀ ਦੀ ਸੇਵਾ 'ਚ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਰਵਾਂਗੇ। ਅੱਜ ਦੀ ਇੰਨੀ ਸੇਵਾ ਪ੍ਰਵਾਨ ਕਰੋ ਜੀ। ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ।